The Wound and the Flags.
A Novel of Martyrdom, Empire, and the Soft Coup by Elias Winter, April 9th, 2026.
1. The Wound. There are moments in the life of a republic when blood does not remain blood for very long. It becomes symbol, then permission, then law. He stood under the lights, as many men before him had stood under lights, swollen with grievance, padded by applause, carried upward by the low mechanical faith of crowds. He had been known for appetites, for vulgarity, for lies worn openly as style. He had been known for the usual vices of aging empires: excess without shame, cruelty without reflection, appetite without limit. No one had mistaken him for a saint. No one had mistaken him for a martyr. Then the wound appeared. Not a mortal wound, not enough to end him, not enough to still the body or extinguish the voice. A wound placed where all could see it, bright as insignia, intimate enough to humanize and theatrical enough to transfigure. Blood near the head has always had a genius for rearranging the moral imagination. The ear, of all places, near hearing, near obedience, near the place where men receive commands and call them destiny. And in the instant after, before thought had time to discipline feeling, the metamorphosis was complete. The man of vice rose into half-sacred light. A creature of appetite became a figure of ordeal. The same mouth that had trafficked in resentment was now read as the mouth of one who had endured persecution. A body that had belonged to spectacle was suddenly draped in sacrificial meaning. The Republic, stupid with symbols, did what decaying republics do best. It confused survival with anointing. The old stains vanished under new radiance. His vulgarity became authenticity. His malice became courage. His ethical corruption became proof that he was hated by the right enemies. Nothing purifies a compromised man faster than visible injury at the right political hour. Nothing repairs a reputation like blood that arrives on schedule. That is why the question began there, with the wound itself. Not only what happened, but what the wound did. Not only who fired, but who profited. Not only whether the man had been touched by violence, but whether violence had been converted into liturgy with impossible speed. When a wound produces power that quickly, one must ask whether it was only a wound. Because there are accidents that alter history, and there are events that arrive already dressed for coronation. There are injuries that weaken, and injuries that enthrone. There are moments when flesh is pierced, and moments when an empire finds the exact amount of blood it needs to resume believing in itself. The Republic looked upon the wound and saw suffering. The movement looked upon the wound and saw authorization. The donors looked upon the wound and saw acceleration. The priests of spectacle looked upon the wound and saw a script so perfect it hardly needed editing. The wound did not merely strike a man. It struck the atmosphere. It rearranged the moral weather. It elevated what had been tawdry into something terrible and half-mythic. It took a figure already inflated by grievance and gave him what grievance alone could never provide: sanctity by abrasion. And so the age entered its next phase, not through argument, not through truth, not through democratic consent, but through the old alchemy by which blood becomes story and story becomes power. The wound was small. Its consequences were not.
2. The Man Who Was Allowed to Live. There is another way to read such moments, and it is the darker way, the more ancient way, the way known to courts and empires long before the Republic learned to call itself innocent. A failed killing is not always a failure. Sometimes the point is not death. Sometimes the point is demonstration. To place mortality near a man's face and then withdraw it is to speak to him in a language older than speech. It is to say you are penetrable. It is to say the line between your breath and your absence is thinner than you thought. It is to say what can be done again. It is to say live now with the knowledge that your continued life is legible to powers beyond you. In that reading, the spared life becomes a leash. The crowd sees miracle. The man feels proximity. The nation sees providence. The target feels management. Those who chant his name imagine that he has conquered death, when in fact, he may only have been introduced to the terms under which he is permitted to postpone it. There is a kind of survival that enlarges a man. There is another kind that enters him like a hook. He rose from the event outwardly enlarged, yes, but what if inwardly he had been reduced? What if the great public ascent concealed a private narrowing? What if the price of surviving the wound was not freedom, but obedience to those whose reach had just been exhibited? This is how old systems govern the useful. Not always through explicit command, sometimes through revelation. They reveal the gap between power and exposure. They remind a ruler that he is not the summit but the instrument, not the sovereign but the bearer of arrangements made elsewhere. He is shown, in one unforgettable gesture, both his indispensability and his replaceability. And once shown, he need not be told much more. The genius of a spared death is that it can produce gratitude where open coercion would produce rebellion. A man who believes he has been delivered may call his handlers saviors. A man who knows he was spared may call his obligations loyalty. A movement that sees resurrection may never notice the chain. So he entered the next stage haloed by injury, crowned by near loss, wrapped in the mysticism that only danger can provide to men who have already exhausted every lesser form of self-dramatization. He did not emerge merely stronger. He emerged more usable. A man recently acquainted with death is often ready to call necessity by nobler names. And the crowd, as always, mistook theater for transcendence. It never occurred to them that a man can be elevated and captured at the same time. They imagined the wound had liberated him into destiny. They did not consider that it may have bound him more tightly to forces already moving beneath the visible surface of events. That his blood had not freed him from obligation, but deepened it. The Republic prefers bright myths. It does not enjoy considering that a public miracle may be, from another angle, a private memorandum. That what looked like the birth of a martyr may have been the disciplining of an asset. But power has always understood what crowds refuse to understand. That fear can be more effective when it leaves the body standing. A corpse ends utility. A living man with a vivid memory can still sign papers, appoint zealots, authorize raids, sanctify wars, inflame mobs, and call all of it history. The dead cannot serve. The spared can. And so the great confusion of the age deepened. The man who had been allowed to live was greeted as one chosen by heaven. Yet perhaps he had only been informed, in the most unforgettable way possible, that heaven was not the hand nearest to him.
3. The Convention of Flags. Then came the convention, which was less a gathering than a rite, less a meeting than an enthronement ceremony for the newly wounded. And there, amid the slogans and the staged patriotism and the rehearsed spontaneity of a movement that had long since forgotten the difference between devotion and production, another image took hold. Not the image on the stage, but the field around it. Not the man, but the symbols through which the atmosphere announced its deeper loyalties. A sea of flags. Not the expected flags alone, though there were plenty of those, draped, as always, over grievance and nostalgia and the fantasy of violated innocence. No, intermixed among them, dispersed through the crowd, raised high by hands that had come ostensibly to celebrate the nation, was the iconography of another state. Foreign banners flickering in an American coronation. A nationalist spectacle saturated with borrowed sovereignty. One saw women in regional hats, figures of provincial myth, waving those foreign flags with the same lifted arm fervour that belongs to the older ecstasies of evangelical life. They did not wave them like diplomatic tokens. They waved them as relics, as sacraments, as things already absorbed into the bloodstream of belief. It was not the mild gesture of allied sentiment. It had the rhythm of liturgy and distribution, of funding and prior arrangement, of symbols carried into the room by design. It did not feel organic, because organic things rarely repeat with such discipline. It did not feel incidental, because incidental things do not dominate a visual field. It felt staged in that modern way by which nothing is ever admitted to be staged, because the highest sophistication of contemporary power is to organize emotion while preserving the appearance of eruption. And so the mind asked the obvious question, the question anyone still capable of astonishment would ask. How does an American political event of such magnitude become saturated with the iconography of another state? How does a movement devoted to chanting nation above all things produce this visual contradiction without embarrassment? How does a convention dedicated to the myth of wounded national sovereignty become so comfortable displaying symbolic obedience elsewhere? The answer was in the room, though no one named it aloud. Networks, donors, lobbies. Courtiers of influence who do not require formal office because they operate more efficiently through atmosphere than decree. The old system by which policy is prepared first in money, then in symbol, then in speech, and only at the end in law. The flags were not merely flags, they were disclosures. They disclosed that the event was not only domestic, that the wound had not merely transformed a man for purposes of internal mobilization, that the convention was not simply about one nation imagining itself endangered and restored. Something broader was present, something imperial, something triangulated between money, theology, war, and myth. The room was announcing, visually and without shame, that its nationalism was already entangled with projects larger than the republic it claimed to redeem. No commentator of the decayed centre could have understood it, because the centre still imagines politics as policy preference and coalition arithmetic. But what unfolded there belonged to an older register. It was a right of alignment. The flags were not decorative, they were the visible edge of a deeper settlement. One could watch the faces in the crowd and see that many did not understand what they were holding. That has never prevented symbols from doing their work. The hand is rarely consulted about the meaning of what it waves. The body is recruited before the mind is informed. A flag may pass through a crowd like a doctrine before doctrine has been spoken. And there they were, hats from the interior, hands raised in near religious fervour, foreign banners glimmering in the light of a domestic wound. An empire so hollowed that it could no longer distinguish patriotism from possession. A convention so intoxicated with its own legend that it did not notice the contradictions staring back at it from every angle. Or perhaps it did notice, and no longer regarded contradiction as a problem. For contradiction is the preferred medium of late power, to speak of sovereignty while displaying dependence, to denounce foreign contamination while sanctifying chosen foreign alignments, to call a nation betrayed while openly advertising the structures through which it is managed. This is no longer hypocrisy in the old sense. It is something colder. It is a public pedagogy of submission, training the crowd to love incoherence, because incoherence, once loved, can house any command. The flags moved in the air like verdicts, and the wounded man, now lifted toward semi-mythic authority, stood beneath them as though the nation itself had been replaced overhead by a more exact set of allegiances.
4. The making of the migrant myth. Then the speeches began their real work. Not the work of describing a country, not the work of proportion or judgment, or that difficult honesty by which one locates suffering within the larger scale of social reality. No. The speeches did what decaying powers always do when they need obedience faster than they can secure justice. They selected fear and enlarged it until it resembled cosmology. He spoke of migrants. He spoke of crime. He spoke not in ratios, not in context, not in the sober grammar by which a responsible polity assesses violence in a nation of immense size and daily disorder. He did not say that in any country, at any hour, thousands of criminal acts occur beyond the spotlight. He did not say that horror, tragically, is never scarce in large societies. He did not say that governance requires one to distinguish the exceptional from the representative, the anecdote from the structure, the emotionally devastating from the statistically meaningful. He brought an image instead. A white woman violated, a bridge, a predator from elsewhere, a scene stripped to its primitive components. Innocence, threat, violation, invasion. A single event chosen not because it clarified reality, but because it could be made to stand in for it. Not because it explained the whole, but because it could be used to replace the whole. This is how myth is made in modern mass politics. Not by inventing every fact, but by selecting one fact and inflating it until it consumes all others. A crime becomes a category. A category becomes a population. A population becomes a danger. A danger becomes a mandate. At each stage, what disappears is proportion. What enters is permission. The migrant ceased, in that rhetoric, to be a laborer, a fugitive, a family, a desperate person, a bearer of history, a creature moving through the brutal arithmetic of borders and empire. He became an emblem, then an invader, then a vessel into which every diffuse fear of decline could be poured. Economic fragility, sexual panic, racial anxiety, masculine humiliation, imperial confusion, urban disorder, cultural exhaustion. All of it was distilled into the convenient figure of the one who crossed. This is why the speech was not merely speech. It was narrative engineering. The old republic had once justified its violences with law. The late republic justifies them with image density. It does not need a thesis when it can circulate a scene. It does not need coherence when it can generate visceral alignment. One woman, one bridge, one violated body, one story repeated with enough emphasis to produce a nation-sized trance. And the crowd, primed already by the wound, ready already for a protector, received the anecdote not as a fragment, but as revelation. The selected horror was not processed as one event among many. It was absorbed as proof of a total condition. The country, they were told, was under siege. Their women, they were told, were exposed to foreign violation. Their humiliation, they were told, had a visible perpetrator. Their fear, they were told, had a border and a face. Once this transformation is complete, politics changes genre. It is no longer argument among citizens. It becomes epic. The nation is recast as innocent prey. The ruler becomes avenger. Administrative violence becomes moral duty. Mercy becomes betrayal. Statistics become weakness. Context becomes treason against the dead. He did not need to mention the thousands of other crimes happening at every moment across the country. Mentioning them would have weakened the spell. Proportion is the enemy of myth. Scale is the solvent of panic. A frightened people must be protected not from crime alone, but from comparison. So he cherry-picked, he narrowed, he repeated, he mythologized. And in doing so, he performed one of the oldest services power can perform for itself. He simplified reality until cruelty became emotionally intuitive. That night, Many thought they were hearing truth finally spoken without apology. In fact, they were watching a people being trained to accept category punishment on the basis of selected images. They were being taught how to feel before they were told what to permit. They were being handed the emotional key to policies not yet fully visible. The anecdote rose from the podium like incense, and underneath it, almost unnoticed, the future was being prepared.
5. The camps in the future tense. The camp is always built twice, first in language, then in space, first as image, then as architecture, first in the mouth of a ruler, then in the body of the state. What was happening in that hall was therefore not commentary on the present. It was excavation for the future. The speeches did not merely interpret a crisis. They prepared administrative cruelty by making it feel retrospective, overdue, almost merciful in relation to the danger invoked. By the time the gates would exist, the emotional foundations had already been poured. This is the most important thing later historians will understand, and the thing contemporaries almost always refuse to see. The crime begins before the facility. It begins before the paperwork, before the transport, before the razor wire, before the fluorescent intake rooms, before the euphemisms of processing, housing, relocation, custody, security. It begins when a class of people is converted into a narrative burden so total that any method of removal can be made to seem responsible. That convention was full of the future tense. Not spoken overtly, perhaps, but vibrating inside the imagery. The country must be protected. The border must be restored. The invader must be removed. The women must be avenged. The cities must be purified. The body politic must be defended. Such sentences sound defensive to the untrained ear. But history knows their sequel. The sequel is logistics. The sequel is paperwork blessed by panic. The sequel is the camp. Not always called a camp, of course. Civilizations committed to their own innocence have a genius for euphemism. They call the cage a center, the disappearance a transfer, the humiliation a process, the wound an operation, the family separation an unfortunate necessity imposed by circumstances no one quite owns. Language is the first bureaucracy of violence. It protects the perpetrators from the full sound of what they are doing. But later, when the archives open and the testimonies accumulate and the photographs leak and the survivors begin their patient labor against organized forgetting, the older word returns. Not because history enjoys rhetorical excess, but because at some point, accuracy demands courage. There are places where human beings are concentrated beyond normal law for purposes of removal, degradation, sorting, or abandonment. There are systems that depend on the administrative management of unwanted populations. There are states that discover, in moments of fear, how much cruelty can be hidden inside procedure. The hall that night was not yet such a place. It was something more important. It was the place where the moral permission for such places was manufactured. And that is why the later suffering was already present, though invisibly, in every cheer that greeted the selected anecdote, in every chant that collapsed complexity into invasion, in every wave of emotion that converted one category of human beings into a civilizational toxin. The camps were there in embryo, concealed inside grammar. The state had not yet fully erected them, but the crowd had already accepted the emotional proposition on which they would rest. This is how modern violence works when it wishes to remain respectable. It does not begin with monsters howling for slaughter. It begins with worried patriots, injured nations, trembling women, righteous fathers, procedural necessity, and the claim that the future will forgive what the present cannot bear to examine too closely. The cruelty is rarely announced in its own language. It is announced in the language of order. And later, much later, when the stories emerge from those places, of heat, sickness, fear, confusion, indefinite waiting, severed kinship, legal darkness, bureaucratic contempt, children learning the shape of the state through confinement. Many will say they never imagined this was what was being prepared. But it was being prepared. It was being prepared the day a newly wounded ruler was raised towards semi-martyrdom and used that borrowed sanctity to narrate an entire class of human beings as threat. It was being prepared the moment a crowd learned to feel endangered by category instead of event. It was being prepared under the flags. History will not remember only what was done inside such places. It will remember the atmospheres that made them possible. It will remember that the camps existed first as a syntax of fear. It will remember that before steel and concrete came myth, and before myth came selection, and before selection came a republic eager to trade proportion for emotional certainty. There is no camp without a story that justifies it. The story was being told.
6. The first betrayal. The hidden war. But the border was not the only theater. While the crowd was being fed its myths of internal contamination, another project moved beneath the visible floorboards of the age. War abroad, already chosen in essence, if not yet fully advertised in language. The empire, like a practiced pickpocket, distracted the body politic with one hand while the other reached for fire. This was the first betrayal. Not merely that war might come. Great powers drift toward war with depressing regularity. Not merely that hawks existed. Hawks are perennial in empires built on the memory of expansion. The betrayal was concealment. The betrayal was that the blood to come had already entered the strategic imagination of the ruling coalition, while the public was still being sold a narrative of restoration centered elsewhere. The people were summoned to vote on grievance, on humiliation, on invasion at the border, on jobs, on safety, on nostalgia, on national insult. They were not told plainly that another ledger had already been opened in darker rooms. The decision had ripened among donors, lobbies, patrons of holy geography, financiers of resentment, managers of rhetoric, and that old imperial clergy whose genius lies in making premeditation look like response. The machinery was already in place. The propaganda channels, the symbolic preparation, the donor appetites, the theology of exceptional violence, the networked insistence that confrontation with the ancient enemy was not merely strategic but redemptive. He did not announce it in his rallies. He did not say to the people, "I intend to bring you closer to a regional inferno." He did not say, "The wound you now sanctify will become a bridge to another people's burial." He did not say, "While I turn your eyes to the migrant, my coalition is setting the table for a foreign war whose authors are not the ordinary citizens whose sons, dollars, and moral inheritance will be spent on it." This is why betrayal is the right word. Not disagreement, not hard choice. Betrayal. For when a leader ascends on the back of one story while silently carrying another, he has not merely won office. He has misappropriated trust. And when the undisclosed project concerns war, that oldest and most irreversible consumption of human life, the concealment becomes something deeper than ordinary political deception. It becomes sacrilege against the people in whose name war will later be waged. The signs were present for anyone willing to read symbols rather than statements. The foreign flags at the convention were one sign. The atmosphere of alignment between nationalist theater and external loyalties was another. The speed with which myth was redirected from domestic wound to civilizational narrative was another still. Yet the public, disciplined by spectacle, rarely notices preparations when those preparations arrive dressed as pageantry. War requires two kinds of silence. First, the silence before it is admitted. Second, the silence after it has been normalized. The first silence is maintained by euphemism, distraction, symbolic overload, and donor discipline. The second is maintained by patriotic shame, by the fear of appearing disloyal once the machinery has moved too far to be easily reversed. He entered power trailing both silences. And because the Republic was already exhausted, already financially decayed, already morally dispersed, it was particularly vulnerable to the old imperial trick. Promise repair at home while preparing violence abroad. Promise protection from chaos while preserving one's loyalty to the systems that manufacture it. Promise order to the injured and deliver war to the distant. The domestic audience is made to feel seen. The foreign target is made to disappear into abstraction. The hidden war was not a deviation from the movement's emotional logic. It was its completion. A politics built on injured grandeur eventually seeks a stage equal to its self-image. A ruler elevated by blood and grievance does not remain content with mere administration. He needs a theater large enough for historical significance, and donor classes intoxicated by ideology, influence, and long-nursed strategic fantasies are always ready to provide one. So, while the people heard about restoration, the coalition prepared ruin elsewhere. While the crowd learned to fear the poor at the border, those above them rehearsed a much larger violence in the name of civilizational necessity. While the wounded man was acclaimed as redeemer, he was being positioned as executor of plans he had never honestly confessed. There are nations that go to war after persuasion. There are nations that go to war after deception. A tired empire often goes to war after spectacle. The spectacle had already occurred.
7. The courtiers of blood. The court assembled exactly as such courts always assemble, not around competence, but around revelation. Each appointment was a disclosure. Each face told the truth the speeches had concealed. There was the crusader. There was the zealot. There was the emissary of holy geography. There were the billionaire patrons. The men who believe history should be steered the way private equity steers a distressed asset, through concentration, extraction, and indifference to those ground under the optimization. There were the whispering priests of empire, who require neither uniform nor election, because they operate in the deeper chambers where money, myth, and policy braid themselves together long before the public is informed. One did not need to hear confessions from the ruler. One needed only to watch whom he elevated. Personnel is always theology in secular dress. A court reveals the liturgy of a regime better than any platform ever will. The Crusader was particularly telling, not because he represented actual Christianity, which would have been too grave and demanding a tradition for such a man, but because he represented its imperial counterfeit, the white-hot fantasy of sanctified violence, civilizational combat, blood made meaningful by myth. He did not carry the tenderness of the faith he invoked. He carried its weaponized costume. He belonged not to the hard humility of the gospel, but to the old Western habit of draping power in providential language so that slaughter might feel like duty. To place such a figure at the center of military power was to announce the orientation of the age, not restraint, not realism, not tragic responsibility, appetite armed with metaphysics. Then there was the emissary to the holy city, the man of piety as geopolitics, the smiling evangel of disputed ground. His presence, too, was not bureaucratic accident, but symbolic precision. In him, one could see the fusion that defined the court. Religion emptied of transcendence and redeployed as strategic solvent. Sacred language became a legal instrument. Ancient land became a prop in the psychic drama of another people's empire. Faith became theatre performed in support of force. Around them swirled the patrons, those for whom foreign war was less a horror than a long-awaited correction, those for whom maps were moral documents to be revised by fire, those whose wealth had granted them the luxury of experiencing the deaths of distant others as a gratifying movement in history. They did not need to shout. The court already spoke for them. What made the arrangement so revealing was its coherence. The crusader, the zealot, the emissary, the financier, the propagandist, the donor, the nationalist showman. None of them were accidental neighbours. They formed a grammar. Crusade abroad, purification at home, myth above law, emotion above proportion, force above institution, civilization narrated as siege, violence narrated as renewal. This is what courts do in declining empires. They turn pathology into style. The bloodthirsty are recast as serious. The fanatical are recast as principled. The purchased are recast as patriotic. The vulgar are recast as authentic. Underneath, the old truth remains. A regime that intends blood chooses those who can look at blood without spiritual disturbance. And the ruler, newly haloed by the wound, stood at the center of them like the one simultaneously elevated by and subordinate to the arrangement. He was the face, but not the entire machine. He was the vessel into which older currents had now been poured. The court's function was not merely to advise him, it was to complete him, to surround him with the archetypes through which the regime could make visible its deeper intent. The public, trained to think appointments are about résumés, missed the symbolic magnificence of the assembly. But history never misses such things. It knows that when the war party comes to power, it arrives in costume before it arrives in policy. It knows that those preparing violence choose companions who tell on them. A court of blood had formed, and anyone who still believed the hidden war was only speculation had only to observe the faces through which the future was being announced.
Chapter 8. The Second Betrayal. The Soft Coup. But the war outside was paired, from the beginning, with another operation inside. External aggression and internal concentration have always been siblings in the family of imperial decline. A regime that seeks license abroad soon requires insulation at home. This was the second betrayal. Not the obvious coup of old photographs, the tank, the broadcast interruption, the uniforms occupying ministries before breakfast. No, this age preferred the softer form, the one more suited to procedural societies that still require the surface performance of legality while their inner balance is being disassembled. A soft coup d'etat. An oligarchic coup. A seizure of the constitutional center not by abolishing institutions in a single stroke, but by emptying them of consequence one humiliating maneuver at a time. Executive orders multiplied like emergency prayers in a faith that no longer believed in deliberation. Congress remained standing but diminished, treated less as co-equal branch than as ceremonial obstruction. Judges issued rulings into an atmosphere increasingly structured to ignore them when convenient. Agencies were gutted. Civil servants were purged or terrorized into anticipatory obedience. The old state, imperfect but still composed of habits, procedures, memories, and minor dignities, was approached as spoil. The point was not reform. Reform respects the existence of a thing even while changing it. This was conquest by internal capture. The rulers' coalition did not look upon the republic as a trust to be renewed, but as a machine to be overclocked in service of a narrower will. Constitutional friction was not understood as wisdom purchased by history. It was understood as insult. And because oligarchy hates delay the way a spoiled man hates refusal, every branch capable of slowing extraction or moderating command came to be experienced as hostility. The legislative branch offended by existing. The judiciary offended by remembering law. The bureaucracy offended by retaining professional memory. Everything not immediately obedient was narrated as sabotage. The cities felt the change soon enough. Democratic space, messy, urban, plural, unresolved, began to acquire the optics of domestic occupation. Not always openly, not always in the maximal form, but enough to alter the civic metabolism. Equipment shifted. Tones hardened. The grammar of public order drifted toward militarization. Citizens were addressed less as participants in a common polity than as populations to be managed under the shadow of force. This is how the soft coup operates. It does not need to abolish democracy in order to neutralize it. It needs only to convert democracy into scenery while moving real authority into narrower channels. Executive command, donor pressure, administrative purge, selective lawlessness, fear amplified by media saturation, and the ever-present suggestion that resistance is either futile or disloyal in a time of national emergency. The old republic had dispersed power because it knew men. The new regime concentrated it because it despised men, at least the ordinary kind who insist on slowness, compromise, procedural dignity, and the maddening limits imposed by co-equal institutions. Oligarchy always dreams of velocity. Democracy, when honest, is partly the art of preventing velocity from becoming predation. So they called the friction decadence. They called the branch structure paralysis. They called the civil service rot. They called judges political. They called restraint weakness. They called centralization efficiency. They called personal rule decisiveness. They called the administrative stripping of the state renewal. And in saying these things often enough, they performed the oldest service ideology performs for power. They made theft sound cleansing. This is why the phrase matters. Oligarchic coup, not as metaphor, but as description. Power moved inward and upward toward a narrowing core where wealth, executive force, ideological zeal, and technological control could reinforce one another. The public still voted, still watched hearings, still heard legal language, still received the normal theatrical assurances. But substance had begun migrating elsewhere. The first betrayal concealed war. The second betrayed the structure that might have restrained the warmakers. Together they formed the regime.
9. Bonaparte in the ruins. Every age of exhaustion eventually produces its composite man. Not the founder, because founding requires belief. Not the statesman, because statesmanship requires discipline. Not the prophet, because prophecy requires submission to truth deeper than ambition. What decadence produces instead is the mimic of greatness, a figure stitched together from residues of earlier archetypes and inflated by crisis into false historic scale. He was such a figure, part Caesar of television, part Bonaparte of the shopping mall, part televangelist of grievance, part mascot of oligarchy. Too vulgar for nobility, too theatrical for sobriety, too hollow for tragic grandeur, yet perfectly suited to a civilization that no longer desired greatness so much as the image of greatness under conditions of moral bankruptcy. The comparison to the little emperor from another century matters here not because the analogy is exact, but because the pattern is. A republic enters fatigue. Institutions lose prestige. Factions cannibalize one another. Wealth detaches from common obligation. The populace grows angry without clarity, nostalgic without memory, exhausted without wisdom. Into that field steps the man who promises not repair, but concentration. Not renewal through distributed discipline, but salvation through embodied force. He converts disarray into personal amplitude. This is the Bonapartist temptation in every democratic ruin, to imagine that what has become too complex for citizens can still be mastered by a single man theatrically fused with the nation's wounded ego. But the revolutionary flavor surrounding him was counterfeit. He wore the aroma of rupture while serving arrangements older than himself. His movement spoke in the pitch of revolt, but its substance was reactionary. It was white Christian nationalist in emotional architecture, though neither the Christianity nor the nationalism deserved the names it borrowed. It fed on demographic panic, civilizational grievance, sacred nostalgia, masculine humiliation, and the fantasy that force alone could restore metaphysical order to a world degraded by mixture, debt, weakness, and loss. He did not create these anxieties. He gathered them, he harvested them, he made himself their mirror. He offered not thought but embodiment, not doctrine but pose, not a future but the intensified performance of injury. This is why he mattered to oligarchy. Oligarchy prefers rulers who can metabolize contradiction. A pure ideologue is too brittle. A serious reformer is too dangerous. A clown with imperial instincts is more useful. He can speak to the masses in one register and to donors in another. He can inflame the crowd while reassuring capital. He can posture as insurgent while deepening the conditions of rule by wealth. He can absorb the spiritual frustrations of a people without ever touching the structures that produce them. He weaponized collapse without intending to heal it. Indeed, his political genius, such as it was, consisted in discovering that decline itself could be marketed as identity. The broken border, the broken factory town, the broken city, the broken family, the broken hierarchy, the broken masculine self-image, the broken empire, the broken church. He did not mend these things. He stood atop them and called the pile a movement. That is why he belonged to the ruins rather than to history in its higher sense. Founders build institutions stronger than themselves. This man devoured institutions weaker than they should have been. He gathered race, religion, debt, spectacle, humiliation, and force into one personal form and offered that form as destiny. But destiny was too noble a word. He was a condensation. He was what happens when a republic loses confidence in citizenship and begins longing for theatre to do the work of law. He was what happens when empire, ashamed of its own decline, chooses costume over repentance. He was what happens when the crowd stops asking who benefits and begins asking only who can make its pain feel magnificent. And because the age itself was already degraded, he could pass for historical. Such men are always mistaken for titans by those who have forgotten the scale of actual greatness. He was not an answer. He was the shape decline took when it learned to smile through blood.
10. The third betrayal. Spending the corpse. Empires can survive many moral humiliations. They survive fewer arithmetic ones. Beneath the flags, beneath the wound, beneath the chance, beneath the migrant myth and the hidden war and the concentrated executive and the assembling court, there remained an older and colder reality. The ledger, debt, deficit, fiscal rot so advanced that even mediocre honesty would have had to acknowledge the obvious. A country already bent under immense obligations could not indefinitely continue the fantasy of limitless empire while relieving concentrated wealth of burden. The numbers themselves, had numbers been permitted to remain numbers, pointed in only one sane direction: less militarism, more taxation of those most insulated from common sacrifice. Instead, the regime chose the opposite: more military spending, less taxation on the wealthy. This was the third betrayal. Not symbolic now, not constitutional merely. Material, civilizational. A betrayal of what remained of the country's possibility of survival as a functioning political community rather than an armed creditor hallucinating its past. The nation was broke, and the ruling coalition responded as addicts respond to diminishing returns, by increasing dosage and protecting suppliers. There is a point in imperial decline when budgetary decisions become theological confessions. They reveal what the regime really worships, not the people. For the people require durable institutions, restraint, social investment, maintenance, and the willingness to discipline wealth for the sake of continuity. Not prudence, for prudence counts. Not patriotism, for patriotism preserves the house before decorating its missiles. What this regime worshipped was oligarchic comfort fused to military grandeur, the two most expensive delusions a decaying republic can fund simultaneously. He spoke like a restorer, but governed like a looter who had mistaken the corpse for a mine. Where would the money come from? The old imperial instinct answered before reason could object. From outside. From pressure, leverage, extraction, coercive access, strategic theft, the continuation by modern means of that oldest fantasy, according to which a declining power can compensate for internal decomposition by intensifying its claims on the resources of others. Oil, routes, markets, obedience, tribute in all but name. When a nation loses the discipline to tax its own wealthy, it often rediscovers its appetite for plunder abroad. But the world had changed. The empire could no longer steal as cleanly as it once imagined. Multipolarity had not made it moral. It had merely made theft harder. Yet the regime acted as though old access could be restored by enough noise, enough brinkmanship, enough weapons, enough myth. It increased the military budget because it still believed force could buy time. It cut taxes on concentrated wealth because concentrated wealth was not a problem to be solved, but the social class in whose image the regime had been arranged. Thus, the contradiction sharpened. A nationalist politics that was, at the deepest level, anti-national. A movement claiming to rescue the country while feeding the exact dynamics that would hollow it further. A ruler proclaiming revival while accelerating insolvency. A court of billionaires pretending to represent the forgotten while protecting the fiscal architecture that had forgotten them in the first place. This is why the word treason acquires seriousness here. Not as partisan insult, but as civilizational description. To worsen the debt while enlarging the war machine and relieving the wealthy is not mere error. It is to spend the country as though it were already dead. It is to consume the future knowingly. It is to act not as steward, but as terminal heir. There are governments that steal because they are weak. There are others that steal because they regard the nation as spoil. This one did something worse. It presided over material decline while intensifying the very expenditures and immunities that guaranteed deeper decline later. It borrowed grandeur against a bankrupt horizon. The corpse still moved. The corpse still saluted. The corpse still cheered. But the governing class had already begun spending it. And a people trained on wound, flag, migrant, and war were too distracted to ask the one question that might have punctured the whole arrangement. If this is rescue, why does it look so much like liquidation?
11. Holy geography and the evangelicals of empire. Empire rarely travels alone. It likes a choir. Its missiles prefer a theology, its maps prefer prophecy, its annexations prefer a hymn. The modern secular mind, smug in its disbelief, often fails to see how eagerly late power recruits religious language once ordinary legitimacy begins to fail. When numbers deteriorate and institutions wobble and law becomes inconvenient, heaven is invited back into the room, not as judgment, but as endorsement. So it was here. The disputed city, long burdened with too much memory and too much blood, had already been recoded by the regime into a token of civilizational will. Sacred geography became a lever in domestic politics. The ruler did not approach that city with reverence for its layers, its wounds, its impossible density of claims. He approached it as a stage prop in the drama of restoration, one more place where symbolic aggression could be marketed as fidelity. Then came the preacher-diplomat, the smiling apostle of geopolitical devotion. In him, the regime found the perfect fusion: piety without tragedy, certainty without humility, scriptural costume draped over strategic violence. He represented a type now familiar in imperial decline, the religious functionary who mistakes domination for fulfillment and confuses the biblical with the bureaucratic. Such men do not encounter land as mystery, they encounter it as confirmation. This was not faith in any demanding sense. It was imperial Christianity, which is to Christianity what militarized nostalgia is to memory, a parasite inhabiting the form of a thing whose spirit it has evacuated. The Old Gospel calls men to renunciation, pity, truth, and the terrible equality of souls before God. The new crusading counterfeit calls them to civilizational drama, chosen alignments, sanctified enemies, and the intoxicating fantasy that war can become obedience if enough verses are floated over it. Thus, holy geography was absorbed into the wider machinery already described. The foreign flags at the convention were not random. The hidden war was not random. The court of blood was not random. The preacher diplomat was not random. Together they formed a symbolic field in which foreign policy ceased to be strategic in the narrow sense and became liturgical. The ancient enemy was not merely an adversary state, it was a theological object. The alliance was not merely diplomatic, it was eschatological theatre for the masses and a policy instrument for the powerful. This arrangement served many masters at once. It gratified the evangelical hunger for sacred drama. It gratified the donor appetite for regional aggression. It gratified the nationalist desire to cloak brutality in transcendent language. It gratified the regime's need to turn every policy into an element of civilizational conflict. It allowed empire to move under the sign of providence, which is always more useful to the crowd than the sign of profit. Meanwhile, the actual teachings of the faith most loudly invoked were nowhere visible. No humility, no terror before blood, no reverence for the human cost of war, no trembling at the prospect of false witness, no grief at the use of sacred words to authorize strategic appetites. Christianity, once severed from the figure who made mercy central, becomes available for almost any imperial service. And so it was made available here. The city glowed in rhetoric. The preacher smiled. The donors approved. The flags waved. The wounded ruler ascended through an atmosphere thick with borrowed sanctity. The crowd, hearing old biblical names threaded through new political ambitions, mistook alignment for righteousness. This is how empire launders itself in an exhausted civilization. It recruits the symbols of transcendence because its own justifications have become too visibly corrupt. It takes the vocabulary of heaven and uses it to decorate earthly hierarchy. It invokes the sacred not to limit power, but to perfume it. The result is always profane. For once, religion becomes a strategic narrative. The distance between altar and weapons depot collapses. The believer becomes an audience member. The state becomes a sect with procurement. The disputed city becomes an icon in the domestic imagination of a people far away. And war, when it comes, arrives already pre-blessed by those who have learned to call conquest faith.
12. The engineers of the synthetic crowd. Yet the regime did not rely only on old instruments. Donor networks, sacred rhetoric, executive concentration, security theater, urban militarization, the migrant myth, the hidden war. It also belonged to the new aristocracy of abstraction. The engineers, financiers, and technocratic courtiers who understand that the contemporary state is incomplete until it can shape not only law and force, but atmosphere itself. These were the men of data power, of predictive ambition, of system-level arrogance. They looked upon society and saw an interface problem. They looked upon democracy and saw latency. They looked upon labor and saw eventual redundancy. They looked upon regulation and saw insult. Their preferred future was not one in which technology served human continuity, but one in which human continuity was redefined around whatever technology could scale. They too had backed the regime, though in their own register. Not always with the overt religious fervor of the imperial faithful, nor with the same ornamental nationalism as the crowds in the arena. Their devotion was colder. They believed in acceleration, in executive decisiveness, in state capacity stripped of procedural drag, in artificial intelligence released from constraint, in a public sphere manipulable through infrastructure rather than persuasion. Their mythology was not the crusade, but the platform. So, regulation was loosened. Safeguards were mocked as cowardice. The future was thrown open not for the sake of the human person, nor for the worker likely to be displaced, nor for the communities soon to be dissolved by automated efficiencies, but for capital, influence, state surveillance, and the fantasy of strategic inevitability. The same regime that mythologized the injured nation also prepared to expose millions to technological dislocation without moral accounting. The same coalition that spoke of protecting ordinary citizens moved swiftly to enlarge the powers of systems likely to devalue their labor, saturate their cognition, and render public truth even more vulnerable to industrial manipulation. The synthetic crowd followed naturally. Once politics migrates into the digital atmosphere, legitimacy can be manufactured by volume. Bots do not need to persuade, they need only to surround. They flood timelines, comment sections, feeds, newsletters, threads, and every fragile corridor in which a person might once have mistaken visible repetition for actual majoritarian belief. A minority position, amplified with enough automation, enough coordination, enough shameless duplication, begins to wear the mask of common sense. This is synthetic consensus, not the slow formation of shared judgment among citizens, not the rough, honest mess by which a people argues itself into temporary agreement. Synthetic consensus is different. It is the algorithmic simulation of social reality. It is a fake crowd with real psychological effects. It creates inevitability where there is only noise, authority where there is only saturation, social proof where there is only expenditure. Even supposedly reflective spaces are not spared. No platform built on visibility can fully defend itself against organized atmospherics. The bot does not merely repeat slogans. It alters the perceived perimeter of the sayable. It tells the uncertain observer, "Everyone thinks this now." It tells the isolated dissenter, "You are smaller than you thought." It tells the regime, "Proceed, the simulation is working." Thus, the coup acquired one more layer of sophistication. Not only executive concentration, but perceptual management. Not only propaganda in the old sense, but environment design. The crowd in the hall had been real enough. The crowd online became less distinguishable. A state aligned with oligarchs, zealots, militarists, and technocrats discovered that modern rule requires not simply coercion and not simply spectacle, but a constant fog of manufactured majority. This served every other project already underway. The hidden war appeared more popular. The migrant myth appeared more obvious. The soft coup appeared more necessary. The budgetary looting appeared more patriotic. The regulatory stripping of AI appeared more futuristic. The wounded ruler appeared more beloved. Everywhere the atmosphere said the same thing. This is the people speaking. Often it was not. Or rather, it was the people speaking through layers of mimicry, stimulus, bot amplification, engineered trend lines, and algorithmic preference structures designed by men who understood that once perception is destabilized, democracy can continue in form while sovereignty migrates elsewhere. The synthetic crowd does not replace the physical crowd. It completes it. It follows the flags into the network. It carries the chant into the feed. It extends the rally beyond the building and into the nervous system of daily life. It turns spectacle from event into habitat. And once politics becomes habitat, opposition grows tired before it even begins.
13th. The monstrous cabinet. Power teaches through image long before it teaches through law. The cabinet, therefore, was not merely a set of appointments. It was a gallery, a visual doctrine, a racial and aesthetic pedagogy delivered under the cover of governance. One had only to look. The dominant impression was unmistakable. Whiteness as the normative face of authority, not simply numerical over-representation, but something more intentional in effect. The regime seemed to understand instinctively that in a country no longer demographically simple, power could still be staged visually as though old hierarchies remained self-evident, natural, reassuring. The cabinet became a reassurance ritual for those who experience pluralism as dispossession. See, it said without speaking, this is still who is meant to rule. But the more unsettling lesson lay in the exceptions. The few who broke the dominant image did not soften it. They sharpened it. They appeared not as ordinary representatives of a diverse country, but as distortions, grotesques, useful spectacles of volatility, hysteria, or menace. Whether by temperament, physiognomy, manner, or public aura, they did not complicate the regime's white nationalist aesthetic. They served it. They made the exception itself appear disordered, uncanny, untrustworthy. This is a subtler cruelty than exclusion alone. Exclusion tells the public who does not belong. Monstrous inclusion tells the public what non-white power is supposed to feel like when it appears. Alarming, disfigured, unstable. A violation of visual comfort. It preserves the legitimacy of the dominant image not by keeping every outsider out, but by curating the outsider as caricature. Thus, the cabinet educated. It educated the gaze. It taught which faces should register as normal when issuing commands, and which should register as spectacle. It taught that whiteness could still wear the mask of order even inside demographic transition. It taught that diversity, where admitted, need not challenge hierarchy if it could be stylized as threatening. It converted appointments into racial semiotics. This was no minor matter, because modern politics lives partly in the body's first interpretations. Before policy is understood, faces are processed. Before doctrine is articulated, a room is read. The cabinet as image enters the public mind beneath argument. It tells millions, silently, who looks like law, who looks like force, who looks like civilization, who looks like deviation, who looks like panic, who looks like permission to despise. And because the regime already trafficked in migrant myth, civilizational fear, Christian nationalist theatre, and the nostalgia of white demographic centrality, the visual doctrine of the cabinet fits seamlessly into the larger order. It was not an afterthought. It was a continuation of the same pedagogy by other means. The old republic, for all its hypocrisies, at least felt some pressure to narrate office in universal terms. The new regime seemed liberated from even that embarrassment. It understood that in an age saturated with image, legitimacy is partly a casting decision. It understood that appointments can function as racial reassurance. It understood that a cabinet can serve as a silent campaign that never ends. So the gallery stood, the overwhelmingly white face of command, and around its edges, the curated grotesque, the useful anomaly, the non-white figure selected not to pluralize the state, but to perform threat inside it. This, too, was part of the coup. Not only the seizure of institutions, but the reschooling of perception. Not only the concentration of power, but the aesthetic normalization of who is imagined to deserve it. A regime reveals its anthropology through the bodies it elevates. This one revealed more than it intended.
Chapter 14. The Republic of Hostages. Now the elements can be seen together. A wounded ruler elevated into myth. A spared death interpreted as leash. A convention floor thick with foreign flags at the heart of an American nationalist right. A migrant transformed by anecdote into demonic category. Camps seated first in language, then in policy. A hidden war prepared beyond the public's informed consent. A court of crusaders, zealots, emissaries, billionaires, and blood-comfortable courtiers. A soft oligarchic coup at home. Executive power swollen while institutions were hollowed from within. A Bonapartist figure rising through the ruins, counterfeit revolutionary, true instrument of reaction. A bankrupt country commanded to spend more on empire while asking less of concentrated wealth. Holy geography converted into domestic theater. Artificial intelligence deregulated in service of capital and control. Bots and synthetic consensus flooding the public sphere with fake majorities. A cabinet arranged as racial pedagogy. None of this was accidental. None of it was merely style. None of it can be dismissed as the excesses of one vulgar man and the fevered attachments of his admirers. The pattern is too integrated. The symbols align too perfectly with the policies too perfectly with the personnel too perfectly with the donors too perfectly with the propaganda too perfectly with the atmosphere too perfectly with the age's deeper moral exhaustion. This was a republic of hostages. Hostages not only in the obvious sense, those detained, deported, processed, threatened, camp-bound, law-thinned, city-disciplined, but all of them. The anxious voter held hostage by narrative. The worker held hostage by debt and technological disruption. The believer held hostage by counterfeit theology. The patriot held hostage by a nationalism already subcontracted to oligarchy and empire. The dissenter held hostage by synthetic consensus. The institutions themselves held hostage by executive appetite and donor impatience. Even the ruler, perhaps, held hostage by the very arrangements that elevated him. This is what hostage systems do. They make every actor feel both participant and captive. The crowd imagines it is choosing, but its horizon has already been arranged. The state imagines it is governing, but its machinery is increasingly aligned to private concentration. The public sphere imagines it is deliberating, but its atmosphere is saturated with simulation. The nation imagines it is defending itself, but the defense has become indistinguishable from self-destruction. Under such conditions, politics ceases to be a common project and becomes a managed emergency with permanent branding. The citizen is reduced to spectator, amplifier, or target. The language of freedom remains, but it circulates through a reality structured by leverage, oligarchy, fear, debt, militarization, and symbolic manipulation. The Republic still speaks in democratic words, but it is learning to breathe through imperial lungs. And yet the hostage condition is difficult to name while one is inside it. Captivity often arrives as atmosphere before it becomes conscious concept. People feel constricted, accelerated, lied to, watched, polarized, displaced, morally thinned. They feel the narrowing without naming the structure. They lash out horizontally because the vertical machinery is too abstract, too distant, too sanctified by noise. They become angrier at one another as the system binding them tightens overhead. That is why the wounded ruler mattered so much. He gave the hostage condition a face people could love, fear, imitate, worship, despise, or project upon. He became the emotional condensation point for a far larger process whose true agents were distributed across money, code, ministries, lobbies, networks, pulpits, feeds, courts, and command structures. He was not the whole cage. He was the mascot of the cage. A republic of citizens can survive conflict. A republic of hostages survives only by forgetting itself. And forgetting, in that age, became a daily discipline.
15. What later historians will name. The most terrible chapters of history are rarely legible under their own names while they are being lived. While they are unfolding, they wear euphemism. They arrive as necessity, emergency, patriotism, security, reform, innovation, restoration, common sense, executive energy, technological progress, border order, faith, realism. Only later, after the dead have been counted badly, after the archives have been fought over, after the camps have been photographed, after the purges have left their bureaucratic residue, after the budgets have exposed their loyalties, after the bots have gone quiet, after the flags have faded, after the slogans have lost their heat, do the truer names begin to surface. Later, historians will have the advantages the living never possess in full: documents, distance, accumulations of testimony, the cooling of propaganda, the visibility of consequences, the humiliating clarity that comes when what was denied becomes ordinary fact. They will not need to guess as much as those inside the storm had to guess. They will be able to trace donor channels, cabinet intentions, legal evasions, digital manipulations, economic betrayals, military preparations, symbolic cues, religious alignments, racial casting, carceral expansion. They will likely write of camps and deportations not as isolated policy events, but as the mature outcome of narratives seeded earlier in spectacle. They will write of executive aggrandizement not as mere style, but as oligarchic concentration, facilitated by institutional fatigue. They will write of the hidden war as part of a wider fusion between donor ambition, theological theatre, and imperial reflex. They will write of the public sphere's corruption by synthetic consensus as one of the decisive innovations of modern authoritarian drift. They will write of the budget not as dry policy, but as confession. They will write of the court not as staffing, but as revelation. And they will return, I think, to the images, the wound, the flags, the hall, the selected anecdote, the crowd in fervour, the foreign iconography inside a domestic myth, the newly sanctified ruler preparing, under the shelter of martyrdom, a politics of camps, war, and concentrated rule. They will ask how so many did not see, but the wiser among them will understand that seeing was never the problem. The signs were abundant. The problem was moral interpretation under saturation. Too many had been trained to consume images without tracing structures, to experience symbols without asking who arranged them, to watch power and call it energy, to hear myth and call it truth, to feel fear and call it knowledge. They will discover, perhaps with some astonishment, how much of the age's violence was prepared not in secrecy but in public, provided the public had been sufficiently schooled in incoherence. They will note that contradiction no longer discredited power, it authenticated it. They will see that a movement could speak sovereignty while displaying dependence, law while cultivating lawlessness, patriotism while accelerating fiscal ruin, Christianity while emptying mercy from the political imagination, technological liberation while constructing new forms of control. What they will finally name, if they are honest, is not merely a presidency or a coalition or a policy era. They will name a structure of decline, a hollow empire seeking rescue through spectacle, a donor class mistaking leverage for destiny, a wounded ruler converted into instrument, a republic soft-cooped from within, while distracted by theatrical injury and selected crimes, a people gradually retrained to accept captivity in the grammar of renewal. They will call it dark, and they will be right. One of the darkest years in American history, perhaps, though darkness is never only measured by body counts. It is measured also by inversion, when law serves lawlessness, when religion serves empire, when technology serves simulation, when nationalism serves oligarchy, when injury serves domination, when democracy survives in language while dying in arrangement. By then, the participants will be old or dead. The slogans will sound pathetic. The certainty of the crowd will seem embarrassing. The strategic smiles of the donors will have vanished into portraits and foundations. The bots will have left only metadata. The ruler's voice, once treated as elemental, will belong to recordings played in classrooms and documentaries. Students will ask how a nation so indebted, so armed, so distracted, so spiritually exhausted, could still imagine itself innocent. The answer will not be simple. But one doorway into the answer will remain: a wound that became a crown, flags that disclosed an empire, and a people who did not yet know the name of what was being built around them. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.